It's Jeremy. We need friends. We've got music and movies on demand. We've got the world in the palm of our hands. We've got fun trips, internships, play scripts and hair snips, film clips, fish and chips at the touch of our thumb tips. Need to lead or breed or feed your cat? Well, it turns out there's an app for that, but we need friends. We've got computers for a fiver, cars without a driver. We've got louder, further, faster, more, a bigger network than ever before, but we need friends. And friends are amazing. See, friendship is atomic. From the nursing home to the boardroom, from the coffee shop to the playground, it's relational connections that make the world go round. See, we were created to know and be known. It's better to eat kebabs with friends than salad on your own. And yet we trace in populous places. We're strangers in rooms of familiar faces. We crave deeper meaningfuls, but experience anonymity. We dance superficially around the promise of proximity, and we need friends. And quantity is no substitute for quality. We need 5G, HD, 24-carat friends, lifelong, fight strong, tag along, forgive all wrong friends. Friends to talk through our problems personal. Friends to call when the cancer's terminal. When it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, your year, you just remember what your old pal said. We get by with a little help from our friends. And look to the one who made friendship possible, whose nail-pierced hands bridged a chasm uncrossable. His scandalous invitation follows the most glorious of amends. There is no greater love than they that lay their life down for their friends. So, celebrate with me the ship most worth sailing and follow the example of the friend unfailing. May we raise our game and drop our cover, invest our energies in one another. May we still be there when the rain starts to fall and accept the most important friend request of all, because we need friends. It's so brilliant to be with you this afternoon, everybody. And I guess I want to begin by just telling you that over the last few years, I've just fallen in love with this thing called friendship. Like many of us, I had a terrible pandemic. As Jeremy introduced me, I'm an author, and my first book came out the week all the bookshops closed in March 2020. It was incredibly traumatic. I remember the moment I found out about the lockdown and realized these plans that I'd had for many months to launch this book were cancelled. And I went upstairs and pulled the duvet over my head and sat in bed for about 10 minutes and had a little pity party of one. But then far more drastically, my mum, who had been battling cancer for about 6 months, a few weeks after that, we found out that her cancer was terminal. And so I spent those first few months of lockdown sitting at the end of my mum's driveway with my then 2-year-old, watching my mum slowly physically deteriorate. And then she sadly died on the 8th of June. I was incredibly discouraged, disappointed, and bereaved. And two things got me through that time: faith and friendship. I really remember who was there for me. I remember the kitchen looking like Clinton's cards. I remember the living room looking like a florist. In our family, we didn't cook for 3 months. We were surrounded by amazing friends. And so as a failed author, having written my first book, actually the first book ended up doing surprisingly well, my wife tells me. But in the end, I really wanted to write again on friendship. And so I decided to research friendship and read everything I could find on the subject. And I fell in love with it. And here's what I've discovered. I'd just love to share with you a few lessons that I've discovered as I've researched friendship over the last few months. And the first is this: friendship is outrageously good for us. I'm also a Christian. I work for a Christian organization. And so I love the Bible. And when I read the Bible, I read the way that the author of Genesis describes the world being created. And 8 times in the creation narrative, 8 things are decided and described as good or very good. The first thing that God says is not good. It is not good for us to be alone. And this is true both for us physically as well as spiritually. So I really believe that the reason that loneliness is such a grates against us so much, the reason that we love friendship, conversely, is that we were created, crafted for connection. We were made for a relationship with one another. And the amazing thing is, well, maybe not so the amazing thing is that our bodies reflect the way that they were created. So as they've examined the physical effects of friendship and loneliness, they've discovered a few things. First of all, when you're with others, your body produces a beautiful chemical. In fact, most people's favorite chemical or hormone, that of oxytocin. Now, oxytocin it's commonly known as the cuddle chemical. It's the chemical that bonds a baby and their mother. It's why we feel it's why we feel so warm and fuzzy having spent time with friends. Oxytocin is incredibly powerful, and it's created and it's made when we're in relationship with one another. But there's also another chemical that relates to friendship, and that's cortisol. And cortisol is as important as oxytocin, but it's actually in large quantities can be quite dangerous. Cortisol helps regulate our blood pressure and our blood sugar levels. It's our kind of fight or flight chemical. It preps us for action. It gets us out of bed, but it also rises when we're stressed. And studies have found that if you have at least one close friend, your cortisol levels drop significantly. Your base level of cortisol is significantly lower if you've got one close friend. But if you haven't got one close friend, you've got a much higher base level of cortisol. And higher levels of cortisol mean more chance of heart attacks, illnesses, diabetes. That's why friendship is so good for us. It has such profoundly positive effects on our mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Studies have shown that those who eat unhealthily, smoke, drink heavily, and lack exercise, but if they've got strong friendships, those people live significantly longer than those who keep themselves physically sorted but are socially isolated. It really is better to eat kebabs with friends than salad on your own. And there's this fascinating case study that reinforces this view. In 1950s America, there was a mystery in a small Pennsylvania town called Roseto. And scientists were baffled when they looked at this town because no one was having heart attacks and no one could work out why. Mortality rates were a third lower than the rest of the United States. Heart disease was almost non-existent in otherwise high-risk groups. So they analysed the water sources. It wasn't that. They looked at people's lifestyles. It certainly wasn't that. They looked at their diets. Wine, cigars, and meatballs were being consumed with abandon. It certainly wasn't their diet. It wasn't healthcare or the air quality. What was keeping these people alive was their relationships. In Roseto in 1950, 3 to 4 generations lived under one roof. Neighbours had deep bonds of trust with one another. Hardly anyone was lonely. The town were the best of friends. Turns out that the secret of eternal life is not what you know, it's who you know. And if you're a Christian, that probably sounds familiar. And that's why it was such a no-brainer to be with you today, which is why when Jeremy's invitation came in, it was just a no-brainer to join with you, because what you do is not just brilliant. It's not just life-changing. It really is a matter of life and death. Thank you for what you do. When you befriend someone, you are giving them life, not only increasing the quality of their days, but the number of days that they have. Thank you so much for all you do and bring and give and inspire in this area. Thank you for those you befriend. It makes such a difference. There is power in friendship, and that's the first thing I've learned. Second thing I've learned is that you won't be surprised to know some of this. I know I'm preaching literally to the choir today, but the second thing I found is that friendship is a really contested space in 2023 in the UK. There has arguably never been a greater need for friends. Forgive me if you know this already. This is your lived reality, but we are facing an epidemic of loneliness. The Movember Foundation, which is a charity that works with men, found that as many as 1 in 3 men have no close friends. Over half of us admit we struggle to find new friends. The picture is not much brighter for women. As I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, 40% of 16 to 24-year-olds say they always or often feel lonely. By the way, those 16 to 24-year-olds are the connected generation, the most connected generation in history. How on earth have we reached such relational poverty in our nation when we have a minister for loneliness in government? We really are in friendship recession. And what I'd say in terms of the challenges that we're facing is that time is like oxygen to friendship. And most of us are really time poor. If you ask most people, in fact, I heard recently that was a woman who she moved from Japan to America, and she started introducing herself to people in New York, saying, "Hello, I'm busy," because she thought that was a traditional American greeting. We're so busy, we wear it as badges of honor, don't we, that we're busy. And so I've begun to look at what are the pressures on friendship. Well, one of them, many of you won't be surprised to know, is we are spending more time looking at screens. Do you know, at its best, so I'm not anti-social media. At its best, social media is brilliant for helping us to connect and maintain relationships. There's nothing better, is there, than a wall of happy birthday messages or the news that the cancer's gone or a baby scan photo. But social media so often can give us an illusion of friendship and often lead to quantity over quality. And especially in the West, research shows us that over the last 20 years or so, we have more connections than ever, but we have fewer close friends. And screens are partly responsible for that. Second thing that plays its part is work and the changes in people's work lives. So interestingly, we're not working as many hours as previous generations. I live in the West Midlands and went to the Black Country Museum recently and got to take my 10-year-old down the coal pit as part of the experience. It was amazing. But then halfway around, having the number of hours described to him, and the fact that in the winter people only saw daylight one day a week, he turns to me and he says, "Daddy, I'm glad I didn't have to work like this." In many ways, we don't work as many hours as previous generations, but more people are working in a household. And critically, the type of work has changed. So 42% of people in the UK and 1 billion people worldwide are what's called knowledge workers, people who think for a living. And what that means is that the same muscles that we use to relate to one another at work are the same ones that we use to make friends, to relate to one another at home. And what happens is so often we get home, and because we've been expending our relational and emotional energy at work, we've got very little left to give to friends and relationships at home. My best mate's a builder. He digs for a living. He also would say he thinks for a living as well. I believe him. But when we hung out yesterday, he was so ready for friendship. But I'd spent the whole day thinking and writing and working and creating and on Zoom meetings. And it's a different equation. And that is changing in the way that we relate to one another. And it helps to be aware of that. But thirdly, in our mobile world, we're also moving around more. It's fascinating. We're only likely to keep in touch and be friends, serious friends, and invest time in those who live within 30 minutes of us. I know friends who moved almost a decade ago to a new place, and they still haven't made any real friends. Many UK cities have a population turnover of over 20%. And research shows that if you know you're moving on in the next 5 years, you're 20 to 25% less likely to get involved in voluntary activities, attend religious services, or join a club. And our social mobility and our geographical mobility is sometimes a good thing for work and stuff. But sometimes the most significant thing you can do for your relationships is stay. And so all these things combine to mean that the cultural waters are flowing against meaningful relationships. And the challenge is that the cultural backdrop in which against which we sit also, I don't know about anybody else, but for me, my news timeline is the worst than any other time in my lifetime. We've lurched from a global pandemic to a cost of living crisis, the threat of World War III, political turmoil, cultural and social division, and ecological meltdown. Happy days. And the challenge is that against that backdrop, we're lonelier and the waters are swimming against friendship. That's why what you do really matters. So the first thing I've discovered is the power of friendship. The second is the pressure on friendship. The third thing, again, as I said earlier, because I think we need an urgent conversation here, is that friendship's not talked about very much. We assume that people are good at friendship. We assume it just happens. But friendship requires effort and cost. You know, there's over 10,000 books with the word leadership in the title. There's hardly any with the word friendship. And as I've researched this area, as I said, I know not everyone is a Christian or of religious faith on this call, but one of the things that I've found as I've researched this is hardly any churches have preached on or taught on friendship. That's why I was so encouraged to hear that you as this network are exploring it. Thank you and well done. We talk so often about marriage, family and leadership, and rightly so. But friendship feels to me to be the most important, least talked about relationship in our world. So what can we do about it? Just wonder if I could offer us this afternoon a few kind of guiding principles for today's world for us to talk about. And I guess I talk to you, I guess today as people of influence. So you have the opportunity within your spheres of influence to help this conversation. You will be doing people such a favor. So first of all, what can we do? Well, I think the first message for our world is that we need to pursue the depth of friendship with a few. One of the honest conversations we need to have as a society is that we have finite, limited relational energy. We can't have it all. We live in a society that you can have it all. When it comes to our relational energy, we can't. There's a guy called Robin Dunbar who's a friendship genius. And he's been studying friendship for the last few decades, and he's an anthropologist. And so what he did was he found a link between the size of social groups and the size of the neocortex in the brain. And so he tried to work out how many relationships can we realistically maintain? How many people would we physically be able to call friends? And the challenge is with things like Facebook, people think they can have thousands of friends. According to Robin Dunbar, scientifically, you can't. His premise is that 150 is the number of relationships we can realistically sustain. This is not the people we would smile at in the streets, not our Facebook contacts. These are the people in our lives, I guess, who we wouldn't feel embarrassed about joining uninvited for a drink if we saw them, if we bumped into them in a coffee shop. Would they be the kind of people who we kind of feel comfortable knowing where we knew in terms of where we stand with them and they in terms of us? We'd feel comfortable joining them for a train journey if we saw them unexpectedly on the same platform. And this 150 number is amazing. So what they found is that the average size of the UK Christmas card list is 154. The average size of a wedding, 144. The average size of a village in 1086, 150. 700 years later, that number had only increased to 160. So this number 150 is really interesting. But then what Robin Dunbar did is he looked inwards. So he said, how many good friends can you have? And how many great friends can you have? And he found that you can have about 12 to 15 good friends. You can have 3 to 5 great friends. And we all have capacity for about 1 or 2 best friends. And what I found is that when I looked at these numbers of kind of 12, 3 and 1, they looked remarkably similar as a Christian to the way that Jesus constructed his friendships. See, Jesus had 12 disciples. He then had an inner circle of Peter, James and John. And then, one of his disciples, John, wrote one of the Gospels, and he referred to himself as the disciple Jesus loved. I think if I was writing a biography of Jesus, I'd refer to myself also as the disciple Jesus loved. But we have to believe that John was the disciple Jesus loved. So Jesus, in many ways, had one person who was closest to than others. But even within that 12, he was really intentional with a few. So my encouragement to you, first of all, as a friend on this call, is to think about your circles of friends that you have and invest your energies accordingly. Friendship matters too much for us just to have acquaintances and mates. Quantity is no substitute for quality. But also for those we serve, for those we befriend, my encouragement to us today for them is to invest well in a few people rather than thinking we have to be friends with everybody. The really good news is we don't have to be friends with everybody. The bad news is we can't be friends with everybody. And so if we have a few people we invest in, what are those qualities that make for really good friendships? Well, the first is time. Time is like oxygen to friendship. If you starve the most flaming inferno of time, it will die out. If you starve the best of friendships of time, it will go out. And researchers have found even that you can quantify just how much time it takes to develop relationships. And for the best of friends, it really takes hundreds of hours of time and investment. I think we live in an instant world, don't we? But one of the challenges is that friendship takes time. The second thing that makes a difference is presence. Zoom has always been a poor substitute for the gift of the arm round the shoulder, the hug or the handshake, the gazing into the whites of their eyes. You know, text messages, emojis, GIFs, FaceTimes, and screens can be a helpful supplement. And as I mentioned earlier, in some contexts, we need to keep digital engagement with people, but there's no substitute to actually being with one another. And the third thing that makes for good friendships is vulnerability. Great friendships can't be built or sustained on a diet of superficial conversation. The best friendships have a series of moments where one party opens up their heart to the other, shares their fears, their failures, their hopes and their struggles. And when that's reciprocated, when there's vulnerability and authenticity on both sides, foundations are set for deep bonds of trust. And trust is the currency of friendship. And what do we find when we've got a few close friends? Well, it's so good, first of all. It's so good for us, as I've mentioned, But secondly, we have friends for the mountaintop. It's really interesting when you look at those moments when you read the story of Jesus in the Bible, the few moments where he's with the 12 and he says to 9 of the 12, you stay there. And he takes with him the 3, Peter, James, and John. I feel sorry in those moments for the 9. I feel sorry that they're not the ones. Do you know who I feel most sorry for? One of the disciples called Andrew. Because 2 of the inner circle were James and John, they were brothers. And then Peter was there. He was the 3rd member of the inner circle. And Peter had a brother called Andrew. And Andrew was left behind. And Andrew introduced Peter to Jesus. I feel really sorry for him. Because there's this moment where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain to the top of the mountain. There's this moment called the Transfiguration. It's probably one of the absolute heights of Jesus's moments. And Peter, James, and John are there with him. My encouragement to us is when something good happens in our life, when we get that new job or announcing a new member of the family or something amazing happens, we need to tell our closest friends first, rather than before we splash it on our Facebook page. Don't let good news reach your best of friends via social media rather than you speaking to them first. So we do need friends for the mountaintop, but we also need friends for the valley. As I mentioned earlier, when my mum died during COVID, there were lots of people who said that thing that we often say, which isn't a bad thing to say, if there's anything I can do. Lots of people said, if there's anything I can do. But I needed a few close friends who didn't just say that. They actually did some things. They walked with me. They cried with me. They were there for me. And what's interesting is that one of the other few moments that Jesus chooses to spend time with Peter, James, and John is in the Garden of Gethsemane just before he's about to die. And he calls his closest friends to him to be with him in those hours. So the first thing I think the message we have for today's world is pursue depth of friendship with a few. Quantity is no substitute for quality. The second thing I want to encourage us to think about today is we need to be friends with people who are different from us. Because we're not just lonely, we're fractured as a society. Do you know 1/4 of Remain voters have no friends who voted Leave? 1/5 of Leave voters have no friends who voted for Remain. 1/3 of white Britons don't have any friends from an ethnic minority background. Almost half of over 65s say their closest companions are their television or their pets. We're divided across age, race, income, and politics. And I think that friendship with people who are different from us not only has something to offer to us, but I think it actually provides healing for our society. Again, thank you. That's why what you do matters. And some of my research, as well as into the 3 within the disciples, has also been within the wider circle of the disciples. And my premise is that I reckon that when Jesus constructed those around him who were going to kind of be his kind of team, I reckon 7 out of the 12 knew each other. They were fishermen from Bethsaida: Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, and Bartholomew. I reckon they were kind of fishermen from the same part of the world. And the first thing to say about that is it's really good to be really good friends with people who are like us. So scientifically, we're more likely to be drawn to people who speak the same language, who grow up in the same place, who have the same education and occupation as us, who hold the same worldview, who share the same hobbies and interests, who find the same things funny, who listen to the same music. And those kind of relationships are really important. But at the same time, we also need friends who are different from us. So after those kind of fishermen, the 7, there's a few other who are kind of curveballs in Jesus' friendship groups. And as we look at them, there's a couple of names that stand out. So first of all, we have Matthew. Now, Matthew was a tax collector, but not only was he a tax collector, he was the worst type of tax collector. He had sold out his national and religious identity for collusion with the Roman Empire to make a quick buck. So you had Matthew on one hand, and on the other hand, you had Simon. Now, under the Roman occupation of Jesus' world, there were kind of different political parties, and they kind of took contrasting views to life under the Roman Empire. So you had the Pharisees, who many of us will have heard of. They were the kind of religious fundamentalists. They thought if people would just stick to the rules, then God would redeem the situation. Then you had another group called the Essenes. And the Essenes wanted to live as far away as possible. So they moved to the desert, waiting for it to kind of blow over. And then you have the zealots. What zealots did is they wanted to kill the Romans. They were the violent resistance army. But not only did they want to kill Romans, they wanted to kill tax collectors. And Simon, who Jesus called to be part of his 12, was a zealot. And I imagine the moment where he walked into the room and saw Matthew, and there's this moment where it's not an exaggeration to think they would have wanted to kill each other. So Jesus deliberately picks people who are different to each other. And my encouragement to us, and my encouragement to us to encourage others, is to invest in friendships with people who are different from us, as well as people who are like us. One of my areas of specialism over the last few years has been around intergenerational friendship. And what I've found as I've talked to young adults is they really want to be friends with people who are older than them. And then I've told older people that these young adults want to be friends with them. And it's like I've got liar written across my forehead. They don't believe me, but I do think there is a desire in our world for people not just to be mentored by people who are older, but for genuine friendships to happen. As I've mentioned a couple of times, my mum has died, but also my dad died when I was 21, which means I have no grandparents on my side of the family for my young boys. So I have to find grandparent-like figures for them in our church and in society and amongst our neighbours. Those relationships really matter. So first of all, we need to choose how we spend our relational energy. Secondly, we need to be friends with people who are different from us. And thirdly, I want to encourage others to join in the conversation. If you have any sphere of influence wherever you are, would you speak on, or would you run a course on friendship? Because I think there's an art to friendship, which I think we've largely lost in our society. There's loads of stuff we can do to help people make friends. We can develop the art of asking great questions. I don't know about you, but I find some people in my life are just brilliant at asking the right questions and being interested in the right areas of life. They seem to be able to tread the balance between fun and vulnerability. And I think we can all grow in this area and help others to do the same. The second thing that I think, there was a question earlier about how we're re-engaging post-COVID. I think one of those things is around hospitality. I think hospitality is going to be key for us as a society and as a church moving forward. My wife, Danny, has become really good at this. She wasn't a natural, probably, she would say, at hospitality, but she's invested time and energy in learning and building her hospitality muscles. My job is in working for the Evangelical Alliance is I preach somewhere almost different every Sunday. I'm all over the UK preaching, which means that often on a Sunday, Danny is left at home. So she decided to invest her time wisely. And she wrote a list of every single person in our church. We're not part of a massive church, about 120 people, but she wrote a list of those people who are part of our church. And she made it her goal to try and get every single one of them over to our house for Sunday lunch in a year. But one thing she did deliberately is she invited people who were different from each other. Only 2 people out of the 120 said they didn't want to come. And she had this moment where over the year, she not only had lunch with everybody, but she also encouraged networks and conversations across the table. She said the most rewarding thing was the next Sunday, seeing people who'd never previously spoken to each other in church, talking to each other for the first time. Could you facilitate something like this? Because when we grow friendships with people of different background, stories, ages, the richest of friendships can be built with people who otherwise we have very little in common with. And finally, I do think we need to have an honest conversation around digital and social media. One of my challenges I set myself is for every meter I scroll down my social media feed, I'll send a little encouragement to someone in my phone book, checking in on them, and seeing how they're doing. I think we can give a powerful message to people to use the digital tools at our disposal for good, rather than letting them reinforce the illusion of intimacy they can so often portray. One thing I'm really encouraged by as I've had this conversation around friendship, as Jeremy intimated earlier, I've spent the last few months of my life absolutely everywhere, on every radio show, newspaper column and TV show that will have me. And the good news is that all of us can grow in this area and we can encourage others to do the same. Friendship really is God's gift to all of us. There's an art to making, developing and maintaining good friendships. We can always grow and exercise our relational muscles. I really think we can put this into practice. But let's be honest about the pressures on our relationships. Thank you for all you do, But let's remember, we are relationally wired. We're created for connection. A friend of mine says you fall in love, but you make friends. The art of friendship really matters. And the scientists, sociologists, sages and scriptures all agree it is not good for us to be alone. So my encouragement to us today, let's pursue quality over quantity, trust over suspicion, and depth over superficiality. Thank you for all you do. Let's continue to raise our game in this area. And let's continue to commit to being the best of friends, because it really is a matter of life and death. Thanks so much for having us today. God bless you. And back to Jeremy.